Hello, everyone, and welcome. Our session entitled Out in Research, a panel built for LGBTQ market researchers and allies will begin momentarily. We encourage you to chat and ask questions and engage in the conversation using your room chat box on the right of your screen. And now I'll hand it over to our panel of speakers to begin the session.
Hey, thank you all so much for joining us. Today we're very excited to, announce basically the launch of Out in Research. So Out in Research is really going to be the first market research focused organization in the US that is really meant to bring together the LGBTQ community. So we are excited to have TMRE really bring us together here to launch this incredible organization. And you're going to hear today from really some insights leaders who are on the cutting edge of research in their respective fields, but all who are also part of the LGBTQ family. So very excited to have them here. And just to give you guys a little bit of background on Out in Research. So we were really founded this year to help champion LGBTQ diversity within the market research industry by really arming members of that community and allies with tools so they can develop as professionals, build connections, and continue to stay inspired from their peers. But also, on top of being a great networking tool, we also want to make sure that we're leading the charge when it comes to LGBTQ market research. And making sure that we're providing the latest and the most up-to-date guides on how you conduct research on these populations and how you make sure that as you're thinking about your marketing, your product development, et cetera, that you're really engaging with this population in the right way. So to that end, we're really going to be focused on three things as an organization. One, it's those networking sessions. So hopefully one day we're going to be back in person at trade shows. Looking forward to the next TMRE, hopefully in person. So we'll have networking sessions as part of that. Two, we're going to be creating a guide. Very excited that we're working with V, who's a professor at Brandeis University who focuses on queer research, who's going to really be helping us lead the charge on how you conduct research on this population. And finally, we're going to be collectively coming together to support, fundraising for some of the leading nonprofits like the Trevor Project or the Ali Forney Center. So I'm pumped to have you all join us today and really launch this collective here. If you're interested in learning more, we have an Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You can also join us on our Slack community, Out in Research. And the goal is that we're going to build up this network and hopefully, really provide a home for LGBTQ market researchers. So if you want to reach out, feel free to reach out to me as well, Abel at outinresearch.com. But without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to actually V. So V's been partnering with us to really put together a definitive guide of what are the latest trends in LGBTQ community and really how you should be approaching it from a market research perspective. So V, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi all, my name is Varun Chaudhry. I'm a professor at Brandeis University. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and I do research with LGBTQ-focused nonprofits and organizations and funding agencies. And I'm really excited to be a part of this exciting organization and to be a part of making this guide come to fruition. So our idea with this guide is to really contribute to the ongoing work of many companies of kind of making LGBTQ communities feel valued and important to various companies and to the marketing and market research process by thinking and focusing on the how of conducting market research. So this is really we're hoping it's going to be a how-to guide to LGBTQ market research. So I'll just walk through really quickly kind of some of the nuts and bolts of the guide, just an example of what's going to be included in the longer guide. And I'm really excited that Out in Research is going to be launching this very soon. So just starting with kind of nuts and bolts, what do we mean by LGBTQ? It's generally speaking an acronym used to encompass gender and sexual minorities or individuals whose gender or sexual identities or expression fall outside of a cisgender, which is to say gender normative or heterosexual norm. So the acronym generally stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. Terms also included in the acronym or implied by this plus that we have here include questioning, asexual, intersex. And I have here a disclaimer that because language and categories like people are ever evolving, these definitions are necessarily incomplete and imperfect. So that's something that I tend to come to over and over again in my own research as an anthropologist, as somebody who works with a range of communities. My research has been focused in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania primarily, but I've worked all over the country with different LGBTQ organizations and communities, and I've certainly found that much of the language is is constantly changing and really depends on who you're working with. So this guide is kind of hoping to get at those complexities, get at those differences, that diversity, through approaching different ideas of language and also thinking about different identity categories and thinking about the possibilities for surveys, for focus groups, for interviews, and various considerations. So we've got some identity terms here. We've got lesbian, gay, bisexual. Many of these might be sort of secondhand to folks in this space, but just for folks who may not know, lesbian generally refers to a self-identified woman who's attracted to other women. Like with any of these terms, there's a rich history here, political history to the term lesbian. Gay describes attraction to the same sex, usually referred for men who are attracted to men, but has also been used as an umbrella term for LGBTQ+, so that acronym. Identifying as bisexual can mean many different things, like all of these other terms. It can describe a person attracted to people of all genders or a person not exclusively attracted to one gender identity or expression. The category transgender, and this is really where my research actually focuses, so I'm happy to talk more about trans-inclusive practices and trans-inclusive research later in the Q&A if folks are interested. I've got some key terms here. It's generally an umbrella term used for anyone who identifies as a gender other than the sex that was assigned at birth. Just to say when babies are born, we usually say, is it a boy or a girl? If someone comes to identify with a gender or sex that's different from that, they might fall under the umbrella category of transgender. That being said, they may use other terms that other people might consider falling under this umbrella: genderqueer, somebody who challenges the male-female binary with their gender identity or expression; non-binary, very similar, but really explicitly identifying outside of a male-female binary. Transsexual is a term that was used particularly in the 60s to the 90s, but we might see this in some older generations. It may be used by individuals who have medically transitioned, which is to say they've changed their actual sex or bodily experience of their gender or sexual identity. And that term has sort of historically been interchangeable with transgender, but this is, again, just kind of overview 101. Things will include details about in the guide. The term queer is often used. So Abel described me as a queer research expert, to talk about this as a queer market research sort of project. And so queer has a political and academic history. It's been sort of about destabilizing gender, sexual, racialized, and class hierarchies, but has also been used to kind of combine and bring together folks who identify across the LGBTQ spectrum. So I say here, importantly, queer reviews the importance of knowing historical and material conditions and context when describing gender and sexuality. So for folks doing market research, you all know very well about the importance of context, right? And I think the term queer, both as an academic term and a political organizing term, really emphasizes that that attention to context, that attention to history, that attention to difference within a broad umbrella of people. So any research within LGBTQ populations must consider, and this is just general, broad things that we'll go into very good detail within the guide, the diversity and complexity encompassed within the LGBTQ acronym. So I just went over a bunch of terms really, really quickly, and there's so much diversity and complexity within each of those identity terms, and that's something that it's important to do your best to kind of try to attend to in the market research that you're all doing. And there's been quite a few different attempts by different organizations, and we're hoping to bring that work together with Outland Research and bring folks and other experts together to talk about this. It's also important to consider the evolving and contextual definitions. So I just talked about context, historical, material conditions. So it's really important to think about how every definition of an identity term is contextual. It's always evolving. And that the identity terms that show up in a survey or in an interview are always going to be changing depending on the different communities you might be working with. And for this reason, it's really important to have as many open-ended questions or just multiple options for folks to click, to identify, to fill in the blank as possible. So just to kind of emphasize the importance of working with LGBTQ communities, Community Marketing Incorporated, which is a marketing research organization that's worked with LGBTQ communities, has reported that, along with other companies like Johnson & Johnson, that the spending potential for LGBTQ communities is as high as $790 billion. It's actually known to be even higher than that. And recent data that I found has said even up to $917 billion. So we're talking a really huge spending potential potential, and it's really worth it to do the work to include as many members of the queer and LGBTQ communities as possible. So just to keep in mind as an overview, LGBTQ refers to a diverse and continually evolving population that includes people from a range of backgrounds and experiences. So what does that mean for the research that you do? So we've got 2 sample questions here about how you might call in the folks who might be filling out surveys or various sort of research that you might be doing. So for a quantitative survey to collect data on the populations you're interviewing, here are some options you could put for gender identity. You've got man and woman, and if you have check all that apply, you allow space for folks who may identify as both transgender and a woman, or transgender and a man, or transgender, genderqueer and non-binary. The terms transmasculine and transfeminine I have sort of defined in an appendix on these slides, but generally refer to sort of the feminine or masculine sides of a trans spectrum. So folks who may not want to identify as a man or a woman, but might identify more with one side or the other of a gender binary, but still identify as trans. So that language kind of allows for that. This prefer not to disclose option is always really important. Folks may not feel comfortable letting other people know what their gender identity is, and when that happens, you can sort of collect that information and figure out what your particular populations, how they're identifying, how they're choosing to identify and share or not. And I said here, your option for other may include a follow-up question. If other, please list here, or remain open-ended. So these other options allow space for the many, many different terms that folks could use to describe their gender identity or expression. Similarly, for a sexual identity quant sample question, the language of sexual identity I use here to sort of match up with gender identity, but sexual orientation I think is equally appropriate. Orientation sort of refers to an understanding of sexuality where someone might feel, I can't change who I'm attracted to, who I'm oriented towards. Identity implies more about the choice of language, I think. So I prefer to use identity in my work, but I think that's open-ended and up to you and the goals and aims of your particular research project. So I've got some options here of sort of the ones I've gone over. Pansexual and asexual I have definitions for later. A questioning and prefer not to disclose. Again, really important to include that as an option. And then the other with a blank or some kind of option to fill in that information. This is a really important way to be inclusive and from jump, right? So people can sort of open up a survey and know that they're being attended to without you having to do a lot of work of knowing exactly who you're speaking to, but you know that people will have lots of options to work with, to identify, to see themselves represented in the surveys that you're putting out. So this is a similarly kind of best practice, which is to keep your gender identification options as open as possible. And this is really difficult, I understand, with quantitative research. It would be ideal to leave them open-ended when you're doing interviews or more open-ended style semi-structured interviews. If you're doing ethnographic work, then this sort of open-ended question about gender identification is really important. You could organize it by option, and these options really demonstrate a willingness to understand gender beyond a male-female binary and sort of demonstrate that you have a priority of including trans and gender nonconforming people and a real understanding of wanting to include as many people as possible regardless of gender. So this forthcoming guide will include this information plus more, best practices, definitions, recommendations for researchers of LGBTQ and other diverse populations. So we'll talk more about this in the Q&A. Then my contact information is here. Again, I'm a faculty member at Brandeis University, which is Abel's alma mater. And I'm really excited to be here and to learn from all of you. So again, got some more sort of appendix terms folks want to look for a little bit, but that's it for me. Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, V, for walking us through that. Definitely, I think as people start to think about LGBTQ research and the best way to approach it, I'm really excited for this guide, and I'm pumped to kind of have partner with you. But now we're going to kind of shift the focus of it. So today we actually have 4 of the leading experts here really in research. We're going to be talking about what it means to be an LGBTQ leader within their company and talk a little bit about their background. So I'm gonna actually exit out here. But first, actually, I think, Michael, you want to come back on? We lost.
Here he comes.
There we go. Well, welcome and thank you all so much for joining us. I know you guys are all spread across actually the world, so thank you for joining us here for TMRE Live today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think it'd be helpful to actually first let's hear a little bit about your backgrounds and kind of some of the LGBTQ work that you guys might do in your companies or outside of that. So how about Nick? Why don't we start with you?
Sure. So Nick Graham. I head up the Consumer Insights and Analytics team for PepsiCo's US Beverages division, based out of New York City. You can tell from my accent that I didn't start on this side of the pond. I'm originally from the UK, been here for the last 10 years. I think in terms of LGBTQ research, by the way, that's an amazing piece of work that you put together, and I think will be incredibly valuable for everybody on this call and everybody watching. So really excited to bring that to my organization, because I think the reality is we do quite a lot of work with the LGBTQ community, particularly for some of our brands like Bubbly, our sparkling water, that's been a big supporter of Pride, and this year has been a big supporter of the LGBTQ community throughout the year. I think the challenge is exactly what V teed up, is the complexity of it, right? And I think particularly for folks in our organization where they might ask a very innocent question like, how do we connect with the LGBTQ community? And you're like, well, what do you mean by that? And this is extremely complex. And I think more than ever this year, it's raised the question of intersectionality, because what about LGBTQ people of color? What about trans people of color? What about people of LGBTQ people who are on low income versus on high income, who are all experiencing very different things right now? And so I think sometimes we face this sort of brick wall of people, like you show them what V just went through and they're like, okay, I don't quite know where to start. This seems a bit overwhelming. Let's just really simplify it. So I think everybody realizes as a business the importance of this set of communities, but I think it's a real challenge sometimes for people to navigate it. And it suddenly feels much more complex than I think people realize going in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's exactly why we started this organization. Out in Research really is meant to become that collective group where we can share that knowledge of how you conduct research on those populations. I don't think I pretend to be an expert or any of us, but I think collectively together we can help start defining what that means. But we're going to flip over to David over there in LA.
Hi, good morning or good evening, everybody. I don't know where everybody is, but thanks for having me, Abel. I work for a talent agency called United Talent Agency here in Los Angeles. I've been there for almost 20 years. And I think what's really been wonderful about working at a company for a long period of time is to see how the company and the industry's attitudes towards LGBTQ people have changed. A few years ago, UTA launched UTA Proud, which is an internal organization to support all of our gay colleagues and initiatives, internal and external. My particular area of focus is on the film side, and in particular, studying how the studios and the agencies and really the entire industry address people who may feel as though they are on the margins or are not represented on the big screen, because there's a very long history the industry not really measuring these audiences. And the good news is that that's beginning to change. We're certainly seeing more of these audiences represented on the big screen. Are we properly measuring them? No. And I think as you were presenting, I was thinking, I just feel like I want to take this presentation and show it to everybody who works in film, because I don't think that people are thinking of what you just talked about on a meaningful level.
Definitely. Michael.
Abel, hi, thank you. Hi there. So, and thank you for having me as part of this important conversation. And Abel, congratulations for organizing this. I know that to be the change maker that gets something like this off the ground requires a lot of energy and vision, and I feel inspired by it. And V, to echo Nick's words there, your presentation was excellent. So I work for a media agency called stands for Universal McCann, belongs to Interpublic, and we are very, very committed to equality and to, I suppose, using the influence that we have as communications companies to challenge stereotypes. For example, we founded the Unstereotype Alliance, which is a really important group of brands brought together by UN Women and IPG and Unilever to I guess, understand, what does that stigma do to people? And in effect, it contains people and it makes people live lives that are not true to who they really are. And at I lead our research division, which means that I help our clients to understand their marketplaces and their audiences. And, our take on that is to really do the work of understanding who our audiences really are. In the UK, we've got a very, very simplistic audience, which is probably the most oftenly used audience in the history of advertising over here, housewives with kids. It's a real classic, and it's a perfect example of just broad brush audiences that are archaic, unhelpful. And so my work and my team's work is all about, like I say, doing the work, running new research, lots of primary research to understand cultures and communities. And a big part of that is understanding and giving a voice really to different minority communities. And so that's really my passion area. And that's what led me to organize and create MRS Pride, which is the UK's LGBTQ Pride network. And so we're very, very pleased to stand shoulder by shoulder with Out in Research as well, and very glad to be a part of this chat.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for that, Michael. And I think one of the questions that I think about a lot is, obviously with so much going on in this year between COVID and, everything that's happening in the States, I think more than ever, it's important to be a champion of diversity and diverse thoughts. So I'm curious, within all your organizations or in your personal life, what do you think it really means to be an LGBTQ leader? And so maybe I can start with Nick, because you do a lot of work at PepsiCo, kind of leading up at ERG and also on the research side.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about that recently, which is, so I'm an executive sponsor for our employee resource group, Equal. And we've been working this year as much on the internal as the external effort. So we work internally, obviously, with our employees and our teams, creating a sense of community, not just for our LGBTQ plus employees, but also for our allies. And I do think sometimes we forget the ally group, both internally and externally, as such an important part of the extended community. And then externally, we're trying to help our brands shape their communication strategies, their brand strategies, to focus on either the entire LGBTQ audiences or specific subsegments. In terms of what it means, I think, look, with everything that's going on in the world, there's never been more important time to stand up as an LGBTQ leader and represent the communities at a senior level. I think we can play an incredible role model to younger LGBTQ employees of all different stripes and all of the different definitions and labels that we just talked about. I think what's really interesting this year is, particularly in a year when we've talked about social diversity more than ever, rightly so, has been the importance of us speaking up on behalf of all of the other communities, right? So I talked about intersectionality before, but me standing up as a gay white male talking about Black Lives Matter and social justice has been really important for our entire audience to see that happen. But I think also just to reinforce that the whole adage about we are not all equal until everybody's equal. And so I think that's been really important for us as an LGBTQ community, particularly this year, to stand up and represent diversity and really support the full spectrum of diversity.
Definitely. And V, you obviously are on the academic side, so a little bit more removed from the corporate side, but you're really, I think at the forefront of queer research and understanding queer populations, and you've done a lot of interesting research yourself. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what does it really mean to be an LGBTQ leader, especially in the academic realm?
I think given the sort of ever-evolving, constantly changing thing that I kept sort of emphasizing in the presentation. And given sort of what Nick was saying too about intersectionality and really in this current political moment, keeping in mind that there is always more to learn, that, we can only say so much from our individual subject positions, and we work better when we are reaching across the aisle, so to speak. So really working with individuals who have radically different experiences from yours. And I think there's so much potential in market research to really work with so many different kinds of communities to say, what is it that you need? What is it that we can do? And I think that's really what leadership is, right? Is sort of knowing where you fall short as an individual, and we all necessarily will, right? To say, I actually don't know about this. Can I get somebody on board to help me think through this? Can I work with somebody who's been doing this with their life, either as somebody who has just been doing this as a side gig, or somebody who's really, lived their whole career around diversity, equity, and inclusion with LGBTQ communities, with communities of color, et cetera. So I think it's really about knowing what you don't know.
Definitely. Michael, same question over to you. And I think it's interesting because you are obviously the champion of MRX Pride, which is the leading kind of LGBTQ market research org there. So you're doing a lot of important work there. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more of kind of what it means to be a champion over there.
Well, I think a lot of it is about creating opportunities for the community to come together. I think for our network, that's probably the most valuable thing that we can offer. There's big research businesses like Kantar, YouGov that have got enough scale to be able to mobilize their own employee resource groups. But frankly, the majority of the research sector is made up of small enterprises and freelancers, and they can't plug into that same community. And so the original vision was just to create an offline space. It's quite social, to be honest with you. We have funding from YouGov. They are our principal sponsor, and that allows us to have the events be catered, normally quite nicely, with lots of nice drinks, and they're in the evening, and so they end up being fun as well. And I think that aspect of it is really important too. This is our second year. We're about to run our third event of this year tomorrow, and I'll share the link in a moment in case anybody fancies joining. But we're starting to realize that beyond events, we have to take more of a leadership stance, just like you guys are saying there, really, around, mainly around defending our trans brothers and sisters. And that is pressure originally that we got from our trans followers who said, we want you to take a stand on this and use the platform that MRS Pride has gathered to put pressure on other bodies and to speak up for us. And in truth, I don't have anybody trans in my life, and so I'm on a learning journey around the trans experience, and I'm being very intentional about that this year, and I think that's important. I think it's harder with trans identity than it is with Black identity, simply because of incidents. There's not very many trans people, whereas people are much more likely to be friends with a Black person and understand the reality of what it's like to be the only Black person in a room. But the big focus for us for next year will be to create platforms for understanding the trans experience and defending the interests of trans people. So in answer to your question, I think leadership looks like taking a stand on issues, and I think being unambiguous and unequivocal in what your position is on these things. And I'm really glad to see in this year of activism that a lot of leaders have taken a stand on anti-racism, whereas maybe last year it might have been considered too political a thing to do. I'm really pleased to see that there's been more or less consensus around CEOs with the brands that I work with around that issue.
Definitely. And David, obviously you work in the film industry where more and more we've seen more visibility with LGBTQ populations, and it's come to the forefront of a lot of conversation that's happening there. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective working at UTA, what does it mean to really be kind of an LGBTQ leader, especially within entertainment?
Well, I think we're talking both internal and external. So internally within UTA, it's an understanding that, we represent a lot of digital clients, TikTok, YouTube stars, and these are largely being driven by younger Gen Z clients. And I think one of the wonderful things about Gen Z, if I can make a blanket statement, is that they are very accepting of their identity and are not afraid to identify their true selves. And so there's definitely an education process that happens just within UTA about who these young clients are. How do we talk about them? We have very unique challenges as an industry, though, our job primarily is to get jobs for our clients. And there are roles that are being written for a very specific archetype or character type. And we now know that the world doesn't fit into these archetypes. So how do we address which of our clients fit into these roles as they're written? But on the external side, the biggest challenge that we face is the fact that, we buy data from 20 or so different providers. We also pull data from sort of free open APIs like Wikipedia, for example. And a lot of these data tools are doing audience segmentations, but none of these segmentations are addressing our community, right? So it's very easy to get demographic data on men or women or age breaks. But if you want anything more granular than that, it's simply not available. And what we're seeing is that the content that's being created is addressing those audiences well ahead of the data that is measuring it. So that's a real challenge that we have in the entertainment and media space.
Definitely. It's kind of interesting to hear all of you work in very different sectors, and kind of even though it's all very different, the same kind of uniting factor of, this year more than ever, the need to kind of champion all these diverse communities and make sure that people, especially that are marginalized, are being supported kind of on a broad level. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm kind of curious from your diverse perspectives, as LGBTQ individuals, what is something that you kind of wish the rest of your team knew about you being a part of the LGBTQ community? Maybe something they don't really understand, or might be kind of an interesting thing for you. And I think, for me, it's always been that I think Hollywood and media has a typical way of presenting what it means to be LGBTQ, right? You're XYZ, you are the person who loves to go shopping with the best friend, or you're the person who was closeted and has emotional damage or something like that. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is just how diverse of a community it can be. And as you've seen from V's research, it can cover such a wide spectrum. And I think for me, oftentimes I feel like a lot of people don't really understand that. And I'm excited that we're going to be able to more define that, and especially in market research, which is at the center of human centricity, be able to help champion that within different organizations. So that's me. But what about you, Nick?
Well, I honestly don't think I can put it better than that. I think you just stole all my talking points. I mean, I think you're right. I think the diversity and complexity of our communities, that's what we need to find a way to represent. That's what we need to find a way to measure. That's what we need to be able to showcase to people. Because I think you're right. There's a vision I think most people have of the LGBTQ communities, and it's much more complicated and much more diverse than that. So you're absolutely right. That's the biggest piece I think we need to land. But I want to go back to something that David said, which is I don't think we can do that as an industry unless we know how to measure it. And so all of the stuff that V was just showing about how to ask about gender, how to ask about sexuality, and there's undoubtedly many more questions like that. I'm just disappointed sometimes when I look at, you're right, David, syndicated data, and it's like, here's the LGBTQ bucket, and basically all various forms of LGBTQ have been put into this one bucket. And you're like, well, actually, that's incredibly unhelpful. Or you can't break it by ethnicity or age or demo or geo or anything else. And so I do think it comes back to, if we want to be able to make an impact, we have to be able to measure these things at the beginning.
Definitely. V, what about you?
I think I could go on and on about this question. Someone said in the chat here that they get a lot of the question, what do you think your community would think of this? And I think that's definitely true for me, representing a few different populations, and often one of few name what the minority population is in the room, whether that's person of color or trans or queer, right? And I think just recognizing the kind of diversity within all of those things seems really important. And I wish people allowed space for more of that having one trans representation or one trans person to represent or one person of color is never really enough to actually kind of speak to hugely diverse populations of people. So that's one of many answers I can possibly give. to me right now.
Yeah, and actually, if anyone's interested, V gave a presentation to my company, Susie, all about the history of LGBTQ movements and pride. And I would highly recommend, if you guys are interested in having kind of an academic perspective, it was probably one of the most riveting conversations that we had at my company. It really helped us shine a lot of light on things that I didn't even know about, the history of the movement and kind of what pride means. So, I think she has her, he has his contact information there, and it's a great, thing to reach out to. David.
Well, I think that, I don't know if this specifically answers your question, but I will say one of the things that I think is really heartening about this, about the world that I live in, is that 2018 was a banner year in the movie business for inclusion and diversity, and at the very top of that list, you have to look at Black Panther and Wrinkle in Time and Crazy Rich Asians and on and on and on. And I think a really seminal movie from that year was Love, Simon. And so, despite the fact that we don't really have terrific ways of measuring this audience, what's great is that these stories are being told at the studio level now. Gay cinema has been around for a very long time, but mostly it's been sort of the smaller independent studios, independently financed movies. And what Love, Simon really showed was that a gay love story being released by a major studio can succeed. And I think that's a message that we need to keep repeating over and over and over again, is that there's an audience for this and that they will show up. If only we could just measure them a little bit better.
Definitely. And Michael, what's your final thoughts on this?
Abel, the thing that I would like my team of researchers to do is to take a stand in our own way, in our daily practice. We've got, not to be too sobering at the end of this lovely chat, but we've got a big way to go before we're doing things right in terms of giving a voice to minorities in the research industry, okay? So in terms of the questions, absolutely those questions, V, but we need to change the culture amongst clients that they're asking for those clients to be put in their screening sections. Sometimes when I put sexual orientation questions into my client surveys, they'll say, well, why are we asking that? It doesn't feel right for this project. Would you mind just removing it, just to be on the safe side? And so we need to create a culture amongst clients where that question is expected to be in there, both ethnicity and sexual orientation and a more nuanced gender identity question. But then also, and this is my most pressing point, I would say, amongst panel companies and sample providers, there is an outrage going on, which is that low incidence groups, including LGBTQ communities, and certainly trans people, if I wrote a quote request to most of the panel companies for a trans sample, it would be exorbitantly expensive, it would be completely unaffordable, and that is why hardly any charities are able to research those audiences, and brands won't be able to afford them unless they're really the world's biggest brands. And so there's a huge problem, and I want my team to take a stand on it, and we do. When we appoint which panels we work with, we look to panels and sample sources that are that don't price minority sample out of contention, because that is stopping a huge amount of research that gives voices to minorities from happening, and therefore those voices are not being heard.
Definitely. Well, we're just about out of time, but I really want to thank all of you for joining us here today. And I'm really excited to have this conversation continue, hopefully indefinitely. And Out in Research will be doing more panel discussions, but follow us on social media, join our Slack channel where you can kind of connect with all these different insights leaders. But again, thank you all so much. And I'm very excited for the future of this organization and to have you all kind of join me in championing this, diversity.